are the tests that we call intelligence tests fair, right? Because we know, for instance, that students from higher income families tend to score better on something like the SAT or the ACT, college admissions tests. Does that mean that there's something like unfair about the way that those tests are used? What about if we're moving even further, not just looking at different social classes within a country or within a culture, but looking across cultures? And this is where it's really important to remember that an intelligence test is testing a particular set of skills that are dependent on having certain experiences and are important for a certain environment. So let me give you an example. There's a wonderful study that they did with a group of children who were living in Brazil who were not enrolled in formal school. So these were kids who, weren't sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 36 weeks out of the year. They were not taking paper and pencil tests. They were not having any exposure to sort of timed math drills that you might have had in the second or third grade. But they were often involved as working as street vendors, right? So selling fruits or vegetables or other small goods on the streets as part of their family business or own their own business. So when researchers gave them the sorts of tests that you would give, North American schooled children, they did very badly on them. They could not do a paper and pencil, timed addition subtraction test. But then if you ask them those same questions in the context that they were used to. So someone bought 3 bananas and they gave you this much money. How much money would you have to give them back in change? They could do that very quickly, right? So we would conclude falsely that those children were less intelligent than North American school children, but it was really an artifact of the test. The tests can't be considered separately from the culture and the experiences that people have been exposed to. So, why did we even get to this idea of using a test to measure something like intelligence? Well, the first intelligence tests were developed in the late 1800s by a pair of French researchers who were interested in identifying children who were struggling in school. So this is at a time where the idea of public education or universal education for children was still quite new in the United States, in France, and in the UK. They were experimenting with educating everyone, not just the children of the rich, and educating them publicly, educating them not at private expense to the family. And they rapidly realized that not all teaching methods work equally well for everyone. We need to come up with a way to identify the children who were struggling. And they wanted to move away from teacher recommendations or teacher nominations because teachers can be biased, right? Teachers might be biased against, for instance, low-income children. So they hit upon an idea that is now such a ubiquitous part of our life that it's sort of easy to forget that it was an invention. Standardized test. And by standardized, it means that everyone of the same age was given the same questions, and that allowed them to make comparisons between people in terms of how many problems they got right relative to other people their age. So fast forward now, I think the average Texas child or student takes over 150 standardized tests by the time they graduate from high school. They're everywhere. But the standardized tests that psychologists use are a little different than the ones that you might have experienced in school. Some of the tests are quite basic. The digit span task is a test of working memory. So it's, can you hold something in your memory, manipulate it slightly, and then repeat it, right? Whereas, do you know what adroit means is a form of long-term learning that is dependent on experience. There's no way to naturally know that. You have to have learned that from reading or from someone teaching it to you, from conversation. So we can think about this kind of dimension from very basic cognitive skills to kind of more elaborated or more complicated cognitive skills. And we can think about even more basic ones, such as processing speed, which is just how quickly can you take in information? There are some tests of processing speed that are literally just how fast can you press a button when you see something on the screen, right? Like, we don't think of that as cognitive ability, but it is a measure of how quickly information is being relayed to our brain, how quickly information is being relayed from our brain to our muscles. The other thing we can think about is that some of those tasks are very language dependent, knowledge dependent. We can think of them as verbal reasoning, like the vocabulary tests or the similarities tests, whereas other tasks didn't use language at all. It's an abstract, symbolic, visual, spatial reasoning tasks that had a timed component. So we can think about these as two domains of intelligence as crystallized intelligence, knowledge-based intelligence, intelligence that's just dependent on kind of experience and language, versus more visual, spatial, fluid intelligence, which is this more manipulation of abstract information, the ability to reason about nonverbal problems. And these crystallized in fluid dimensions of intelligence actually change differently over the course of a person's life.
Yeah, and I think you can think about how you might expect those to change just based on your understanding of them. So, right, if we're thinking about crystallized intelligence, this comes from experience, okay? So how is that likely to change over the course of the lifespan? And then you can think of fluid intelligence, right, as something that requires being nimble and being quick and being alert and those sorts of things. So how would you anticipate that might change over the course of the lifespan? Well, the crystallized intelligence, it turns out, continues to grow and increase. So your scores on crystallized intelligence will continue to increase until your 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they'll begin to level off at the 50s and 60s and then decline as you get into old age, when it's harder to retain these sorts of information. What about fluid intelligence, the one that requires sort of being mentally nimble? Fluid intelligence tends to peak at people in their early 20s, around 22 to 25, and then it's going to decline slowly from here on out. So I think it's really fascinating to think how these two types of intelligence interact and how they change over the course of the lifespan.